Okay. Is this on? Okay. All right. Welcome to the CTLA workshop on information literacy, presented today by Dr. Nancy Knowles and Sarah Ralston. All right. I'll let you two take it away.
Thank you. For those online, this is Nancy Knowles. Sarah and I have been working with CTLA materials and also with materials developed by EOU library staff. So we're gonna talk through those things. We'll start out with the AAC&U value rubric. We'll move into the library rubric, and then we'll talk a little bit about a collection of information literacy example assignments that the library staff has put together. So that's the plan for our conversation today. And we'd just like to invite folks here in the room maybe to introduce themselves and say something about an information literacy assignment that you use. And so you can think about that for a minute. And maybe something that's unique to you or different from the typical sort of like research assignment. How do you scaffold? Are there particular things you do to help students, locate, evaluate, integrate, and cite sources, comprehend sources, those kinds of things? So I'll just start and say that I like students to do a rhetorical précis of articles. I'm particularly interested in students being able to comprehend scholarly articles, at least the gist. So we work quite a lot on being able to identify the article's argument and contents and talk about audience, purpose, credibility, etc. And then the students have an opportunity to respond to the article, which often leads them in their own direction of writing about the topic. So that's something that I use as a scaffolding tool.
Okay, so my experience is much more specific or dedicated to information literacy instruction. So as an instruction librarian, information literacy is really my discipline. So I do teach credit-bearing courses, meaning that all of my assignments are related to information literacy and have different levels of information literacy outcomes scaffolded into them. And then I'm also invited to co-teach with other faculty in the disciplines. And that side of things is often a mix of what I consider kind of the true information literacy, critically thinking about sources, knowing what different types of source, knowing more about different source types and how to evaluate source types critically. And then the other side of that is the searching and finding. So how to navigate information, search tools, and library resources, and those types of things in order to find information. So whereas I think most of your interest and experience is more on how information is used in writing assignments, mine is more about the information sources themselves.
Hey everybody, I'm Sherry Rysdam. I'm the director of the Writing Center and faculty member in English Writing. And I almost get emotional about this topic because it is so important to humanity in the world of AI and fake news. Information literacy seems like it's key to democracy. I mean, it's so much hinges on it. So I always teach an annotated bibliography in my comp courses, my first year comp courses. I've taught what's sometimes called basic writing for many, many years, and I've always immediately integrated annotated peer-reviewed sources. We're looking at the library right away. When some other approaches to that level of writing is like, oh, they're not ready for it yet, right? So I'm integrating it right away early on. So that's a little bit unique. And just now thinking about it, I'm not teaching a first-year writing course this term, and I have a draft from students coming in. It's really a struggle. There's several. We need more outside sources, support, and I'm realizing probably need to bring that annotated bib or more of this information literacy sooner in this course too, right? It's it's never ending, it seems.
I'm Angela Vassenkool in the College of Education. Let's see. A course I've been teaching or just started teaching last year. Well, I've taught the course for a while, but we changed how the course was taught. And the students have been, they're seniors, and they are writing a context for learning and really looking at their community where they are student teaching and looking for data and understanding their community. So really looking at the demographics, but digging deeper into how does this community and the school merge together. And so I've asked them to look for different articles and to describe the community. And so looking at what's real news versus not real news that can be brought into a scholarly writing piece that then goes into their teaching portfolio to describe their community and the demographics and the socioeconomic status and on and on and on. So that's been a great piece that we've been working on.
Great, thank you. Let's take a look now at the AAC&U Written Communication Value Rubric that we've been working with for several years in assessment. And we're looking particularly at the sources and evidence line. So one part of written communication assessment involves information literacy. And the capstone level criterion is demonstrates skillful use of high quality, credible, relevant sources to develop ideas that are appropriate for the discipline and genre of the writing. Right? So we have a very sort of basic description of what excellence looks like in this category. I'll mention just from the sort of anecdotal moment of my looking at assessment data from the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences this year. When we pooled our data across programs, this sources and evidence criterion was the lowest. So in the rubric, the scores go from benchmark at 1, milestones level 2 and 3, and capstone 4. So all of the other criteria, the sort of average score was above a 3, but the sources and evidence score was below 3. So it was the only one that was that low. Those included lower division and upper division students. So again, it's just kind of a ballpark, but at least it gives us a sense of perhaps where students are struggling or where faculty are maybe struggling to support students. So this is definitely something that is important to us and we want to focus on. But this rubric isn't as developed as the rubric that the librarians have developed that I'd like to talk about next. So can we go to the next one? So this rubric, the EOU Information Literacy Rubric for undergraduates, I'll ask Sarah Ralston to speak to this because it was developed here, and it's very thorough in the way that it's identifying criteria for assessment and imagining what it means to be proficient.
Yeah, so this is where I think my interest as a librarian and all of your library liaisons is going to be a little bit divergent from your interest. You know, when I look at the sources and evidence criteria on the written communication value rubric, and I'll just read it again, demonstrates skillful use of high quality, credible, relevant sources to develop ideas that are appropriate for the discipline and the genre of the writing. My focus is on high quality, credible, relevant sources. And I think about things like, how do students know what types of sources are high quality, credible, et cetera, in a given context? Because that looks different in different situations. If we're talking about the news, there's a lot of ways that we can look at the news and kind of classify it as high quality or credible or reliable or biased or unbiased, et cetera. If we're looking at reports and data and raw statistics, we probably are using some different criteria in order to define what's credible and high quality, et cetera. If we're talking about peer-reviewed sources, that often means something different altogether. And that can look a little bit different in different fields as well. So one of the things that I hear a lot when I'm working with faculty who teach upper division courses is I'm requiring peer-reviewed sources, and they're not using peer-reviewed sources. They're just finding sources from the web. And so then we talk about how would they know what peer-reviewed sources are? At what point in their academic career are they learning that? So to some degree, some students are learning that in writing courses, but of course we have a lot of students that are coming to us with dual credit and they're not getting the same experience in high schools where they're not connected to an academic library as they would if they were taking the class here. And there isn't really any consistent place where students are getting that baseline. So we created this rubric for a couple of reasons. One is AAC&U does have a value rubric for information literacy. Information literacy is not an outcome that we are assessing on this campus, but they do have a value rubric. It is pretty out of date. Actually, at this point, it's significantly out of date, more than 10 years out of date, and it doesn't follow the same professional frameworks that we use in library instruction. And so we developed this in part as an alternative to the value rubric, thinking about, how we might assess information literacy as we are actually teaching it here, which is a conceptual-based approach instead of a skills-based approach. The value rubric is definitely more skills-oriented than concepts-oriented. And we borrowed a lot of information from other schools that have their own rubrics, as we do. We also took a lot of time on this. I think this was developed in like 2018 or 2019, and we at the time shopped it around to all of the colleges. We got input from representatives in each college, and we really were trying to be as discipline neutral as possible. So information literacy, this line again in the value rubric, this is the written communication value rubric, so that's the context for it. Even though that could be applied in different disciplines, different disciplines think about things like credible and relevant in different ways. And so our rubric was attempting to be a little bit more discipline neutral for that reason. So my big question, and I'll kind of let Nancy give the discussion prompt, but what I'm always interested in is what are you all doing to help students achieve learning outcomes related to information literacy? And how can these tools, these rubrics, inform assignment design or instruction planning to try and have better outcomes in terms of information literacy for students?
So maybe to frame that kind of exploration, we could take a look at the criteria in the EOU information literacy rubric for undergraduates. Inquiry being the first, engage in the reflective discovery of information. Search process, engage in the reflective discovery of information. Matching sources to need, demonstrate an understanding of how information is produced and valued. Use of information, use information in creating new knowledge. Attribution and citation, participate ethically in communities of learning. So what I'm thinking we could talk a little bit about first is perhaps a deeper dive in some of the strategies that we use to support this kind of work with students. I think I truncate a lot. Like I feel like I don't have enough, I feel that I don't have enough time to do all of the things I would like to do with information literacy. And so I usually do the things that are most important to the intellectual tasks I'm asking students to do. I'm also thinking about the assessment, again, the sort of written communication assessment that we just went through. And one of the faculty in English talked about the fact that at the 100 level, which course was being assessed, she doesn't really teach this at all. Like she provides sources, kind of what Sherry was talking about. She provides sources to students and provides the citations to them as well, right? So that they can actually focus on processing the documents, learning the strategies that scholars use to present information, becoming more familiar with the genre. So it's a question in my mind, like what do we do at the 100, 200 level? And how does that translate into the 300, 400 level? Like, are there pieces of this that we teach at the different levels? Do we differentiate? Do we truncate? How does that work as students progress up through till they're doing their capstone work. So I think I'm just going to talk a little bit about, again, my area of expertise, which is literary analysis. And in that work at the 100 level, I'm primarily working with secondary materials in excerpted form. So I'm getting students to read, process, comprehend, understand, and then integrate ideas into their own analysis of into their own literary analysis, so that they're thinking about what is a primary source in literary studies and what is a secondary source, and how do I use a secondary source without feeling controlled by it, right? So that the student is also developing their own analysis of the literature while they're still listening to the secondary source material. So at the 100 level, I'm very much trying to help students sort of mediate the different kinds of texts and still keep their own arguments and own interpretations and deliver on those. At the 200 level, I'm asking students to read scholarly articles, again, provided by me, that they're not locating, and the citations are also provided by me. So again, I'm truncating the process. There's no inquiry, there's no search process. They're told which sources they need to work with by me. And so the real focus is on the use of information. By the 300 level, I'm asking them to do more. We're doing more with inquiry, we're doing more searching. They have to usually come up with a set of sources that they locate on their own, and then do the rest of the things I've been training them to do. They also need to do attribution and citation on their own. And by the capstone, they're working with a much longer list. They're doing a detailed annotated bibliography. So I'm thinking about the way in which courses scaffold one to the next, even when students don't take them in order. I'm also thinking about, again, how that sort of use of information literacy is functioning in the class as a whole. So I'm curious with other folks here in the room to talk a little bit about how you're thinking about this more detailed set of criteria, how you're thinking about information literacy across the curriculum, and how does that look? What does that look like in your different fields? So Sarah, I don't know if do you want to talk to that? Okay. Should we just? Okay. Should I turn Cody, should I turn this mic off if we come there? How's the sound? Good? Yep. Okay, great. Well, I guess I'll toss it to Sherry, because we're talking about 100 level and writers often that come into college unprepared. So they're being challenged to do the full, right? The full sort of, to meet the full criteria in the list on the information literacy rubric. Are there particular things you do with students who are coming in underprepared to college that help scaffold them into being successful or starting to acquire some of these skills?
I hope so. The course I'm thinking about right now as we talk through this is Writing 115 when I teach it on campus. And of course, teaching it online is kind of a different approach, just if not more important, right? Because it's a different setting. But for the last 115 course I taught, 100 level on campus, one of the things that stands out to me is, last week we talked about how writing is a process and this information literacy is a process. So when you were saying students get to the junior and senior level, and have they interacted with a peer-reviewed source before? Do they know what that means? Has it been scaffolded? I think yes, if they took my class. However, I think it's really possible that they could have left that class, and you could ask them now, and they would say, oh, I don't know, right? Because they are so overwhelmed with new information at that level, in that first, probably through their entire college experience, right? It's just like drinking from a fire hose. And so was that enough, right? To, you know, and I like to think that if we just keep coming back to it, if it's just a regular part of most classes, that it starts to sink in and they're able to do the things effectively. So one lesson on it in class isn't probably going to, you know, solve the issue even a week, which is kind of how I frame most of my writing classes. This week we're doing, you know, we're looking closely at the library and how to use the library, or information literacy, however I frame it. It's not enough, I'm sure. So in that 100 level course, we do inquiry, often setting up assignments of asking them to write about their lives, about the questions and problems that are of interest to them. And I really love it when they realize some weird niche interest of theirs is actually an academic conversation. So, you know, they're like, well, I just play Call of Duty. It's not like, oh, actually, there's a lot about video games, and, you know, this whole world can open up to them. So there's quite a lot of writing in terms of the inquiry stage. The search process, that's probably going to get a day. I often do an assignment where they're generating keywords related to the thing that they want to write about and explore, generating phrases that are related, and then we go to the library website and we enter in those keywords and kind of experiment with what yields results, what gets 200,000 results, and what gets 15 results that are really specific to what you're looking for. So I think that's happening. Now, I think the harder part at the 100 level is in actually matching sources and using the information, because, you know, there's just often a lot more literacy work that needs to happen at that point. And so they might see a peer-reviewed article that seems related, it's at the top of the list, they choose it. Okay, that's the piece I'm going to work with. And it's maybe not the best or most relevant, and then their ability to kind of work through it or read it, comprehend it, apply it, that's a work in progress. And so that may or may not ever really happen effectively, the 100 level, and using it, you know, to help support their claim, to demonstrate that they're a part of an ongoing academic conversation. That's another phrase I use a lot with this is, I want to see you join this conversation. There's a conversation happening, read it, participate in it. That all is less finished. And then citing sources and attribution, I would say that we talk about that too. And that's really changed in recent years, how students think about citation, because I mean, I used to do some really hands-on, practical kind of, what's it called? Formulaic attributions, you know, introductory clauses, or, you know, those kinds of things. I should do that more. It's fun and people like it. But the citations, yeah, I don't know. I can't say exactly how that's changed. Maybe it has to do with AI and the way that, or like citation generators and the way that they're using those. So oftentimes, it used to be where students might use a citation generator and it would make citation generator errors, which would make me realize what I needed to do to help them. Now the generators are a lot better, and so they might get a lot further down the process where before I realize that there's some instruction that needs to happen with citation. So that's actually changed a little bit. So those were some initial thoughts about what this looks like in a typical 100 level writing course for me.
Could I follow up on a few things? In terms of like drinking from a fire hose, like the first year students that are just being overwhelmed by new skills and new information and new content, I think that's absolutely true. I think that's one of the reasons why we've taken, well, I know that's one of the reasons why we've taken out the big information literacy component from the first year experience classes, is because they were learning those concepts in a vacuum. They weren't actually having opportunities to really apply them. And then by the time they were juniors or seniors and actually needed them, they didn't remember. And I would see them. I would be in their classes and I'd be like, remember when we talked about this? And they're like, not really. And I polled student government, and we did some surveys and tried to figure out, like, you know, how relevant do you think this is to your first year experience and your first year writing? And most of them would say things like it gives them a certain degree of confidence about using the library, but then they never needed to use it until they were seniors. And then they were like, oh shoot, I should have paid more attention, or I wish I'd kept track of that. The other thing I wanted to mention has to do with the search process, like actually like teaching students how to search effectively. I'm finding that's less and less necessary. I think students need to be introduced to resources beyond AI and Google so that they know what a database is or what the library catalog is and what the difference is between the two of those things. And that searching is going to be a little bit different, but they can figure out how to search. Those tools are getting better and better all the time at understanding natural language or processing natural language, and they're now starting to have AI tools built into them that makes it less necessary to use like really structured Boolean searching like we would have been teaching 10 years ago. So, I mean, I think the information landscape as it continues to change influences how much of those skills that we need to teach, and that's why for me it always comes back to the concepts. You know, if students are understanding the concepts that enable them to think more critically about information, if they understand that very concept, that scholarship is a conversation, and what that actually means in terms of sources linking together and why we cite them, as well as how we cite them, then they can adapt as well to the changing system. In terms of citation generators, I think you're absolutely right. That has changed how students learn citation and how they do citation, and AI is changing that as well. Because you can just ask ChatGPT, you know, give me this journal, give it a link, and then say, can you put this in APA format? And it will do better than what the databases are often doing. And I think a lot of students are just using it in that way. And that is going to, well, who knows what's going to happen in the next 5 years with that, but I think that's gonna probably take the place of those traditional citation generators that students would have used. And that's a whole other conversation we can have.
About a year ago, ChatGPT, the free version, was still jumbling citations. Is it getting better?
It is. Yeah. I mean, and I tell, you know, I'm teaching a library class now, an information literacy class, and, you know, we're just starting to talk about citation, and we do citation generators within the databases. So like all the EBSCO databases have one built in. Everything has one built in now. Google Scholar has one built in. And we talk about how the citation that comes out of it is only as good as the metadata that goes into it. So sometimes you'll see in a bibliography, it's in all caps. Like that's a notorious EBSCO problem with the metadata, is that the citation will be spit out in all caps. But as the large language model that ChatGPT and other tools have been trained on have been updated and tweaked over the last year even, I think it really has improved. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's likely to continue to improve. I still think in some fields, students should probably learn, I don't always feel like they need to learn citation formatting so that they have it memorized, but I think they should learn how to find an expert tool and compare the citation that they have just written with the expert tool and make sure that it matches up in sort of a template way. But is that actually happening in the wild? I don't think so. I think they're using whatever shortcuts they can find, and I think we let them off the hook all the time. I hear that from a lot of people who will say, I don't really care if the citation is formatted right, I just care that it's a journal article, or I just care that they did cite it. I think that happens a lot. And so what message does that send if we do that?
I was thinking about the last time I checked, you know, about a citation to see if it was generated correctly. It was kind of an unusual popular source, And I think that, I'm trying to remember, I was like, actually, I would change this, right? And, you know, I still kind of tweaked it a little bit. There's a video, it's kind of older, called How to Cite a Cereal Box. I don't know if anybody's seen it, but I like teaching citation for, you know, like you said, you don't necessarily have to memorize these rules, but I think it's still really important to know what's in it and why it's in that order. So particularly when you have an unusual source where you have to make some judgment calls about what should go where, you can do it. And so I think that's a moment where, yeah, the standard stuff's being generated pretty effectively now. What about less typical things?
Or even like podcasts, you know, students are citing podcasts more frequently, and that's not always really easy to find in the guides.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Angela, do you teach upper division for sure? Do you have any lower division?
It's fun listening to the conversation because definitely would say, because we're a 2-year program and it's the end of the last 2 years, there is for me, and there's a sense that, well, by the time they get to their junior year, there's some of this has obviously, we hope they've had experience with it in their gen eds, right? So some of the exposure and practice and whatnot. And we definitely, I would say, students come into the classes, and I know that, like you said, they're drinking from a fire hose, so we know that they're going to not get everything, and we're going to have to practice certain things. So depending upon what we're doing in class, we may have to, you know, remind them about certain things or certain types of writings. And then you come into a college of education, and we aren't necessarily writing a lot of papers. And there are papers that are written. I can name different classes where I know that they're going to write a specific paper, they're going to cite sources. But we're doing a lot of, we're planning for what they're going to teach, right? So it's a different type, but they're still looking for sources and correct information and how to teach it correctly and how to find, so it's like, how do we dig into the databases correctly and have that experience, and looking for, we've had the teaching channel up in the library for a while, and are they using it, not using it, or are they just going right to YouTube and finding a video? Typically they're going right to YouTube and finding a video. Where we have something there that's really structured for them, that it's not cheap either to have that source. And even when I'm finding, you know, even when we start trying to use a lot of alternative sources, so OERs, but also like, here's the latest article on this best practice, and then realizing that they can't necessarily read it in the way that we would want them to. Like, it's too overwhelming to read this journal article or whatnot. So then walking them through, okay, this is how you read it. And so then I created this fun, like, these are Angela's 5 steps for how to read this article. And we don't start from the beginning and go to the end. We actually look at all the titles, and then we look at the bold words, and then we look at the pictures, and we look at the graphs, and then we go back and we figure out, okay, now we're going to bring these contexts together. So kind of that's how I've approached it for teaching students who, and then they come from all over. They may not have been EOU students as freshmen and sophomores, because in the College of Ed we also take in a lot of transfer students from a lot of different places. So then I can't go and say, hey, what have y'all been teaching? Right? And that's not meant as a bad thing, but just what experiences have they had, and where are the holes, right? Definitely the citing of sources and looking for sources. College of Education, we switched to APA, right? So a lot have not necessarily had a lot of exposure to APA, or at least that's what they tell me. So that's a whole new process of, actually, we switch things around, and then it's a conversation. Well, why? Because, right? So we have to talk about that. But then also when they're researching theorists and then getting into their justifying why they're making the educational decisions they're making, and justifying why they're using the instructional strategies they're using, that needs to be included in their portfolios and justification and narratives when they are getting to the end of their senior year. I I'm grading those right now for another university, and so looking for why is the justification there, and that's a hard skill for students to be able to put the justification and say this is the why because I found it here and this makes sense and I've put these two pieces together. So that's a lot of what we're doing at the upper level, and not only with our juniors and seniors, but also with our MAT students or our graduate students. So that's what we spend, I would say, a lot of time looking for the evidence. But like I said, I can point out in several different methodology courses where they are writing papers and using that is a strategy, right? This is how you write a paper, so they will use that in their course to turn, they're like, why am I writing papers? Well, it's an important work. You will be teaching that to your students, so you still need to have that practice and structure and understanding, and flipping it from the other side of being the teacher in charge of it, no longer the student side of it. So that's an interesting flip for students to approach it from that context of what are you looking for.
Right.
And that's kind of where we've gone. So it is a different aspect of teaching. So when I look at the communication rubric, it is a different look when I'm looking at it through the lens of the College of Education, because it's not necessarily just, oh, I'll assign this paper and we'll look at it through this it's just a different look. And so I know even when we did UWR, finding the right course, the right assignment at that level, it was tough to find the right piece that met all of the requirements. Found it, had to wiggle things around and get it to work, but it took some maneuvering to make sure that all of that fit in the right way. And I do think the students will benefit from it, for sure. They did a lot of digging and finding a lot. I mean, I was impressed with the different resources, because I gave them a small list. Here's a couple to get you started with a few resources, very basic. What else can you find? And they dug and they found, and then they shared, oh, I found this in my community, maybe there's something similar in your community. And I couldn't let them research in their own community because I needed to be able to give them feedback for on their paper. So they chose an area of Oregon that they wanted to research, because for their final portfolio, they have to be able to research their area that they student teach in and get actual feedback. So I can't give them feedback on something that they're gonna do for a final portfolio. So they chose another area, but it was really neat that they could pick an area, really dive into it, go through this process, and write into that level in a way that was like, okay, they have learned a lot of these skills along the way. Or the ones who struggled, we were maybe able to help them improve some skills at the beginning of their senior year, so by the time they got to the end, they could have a little bit of practice so that they could finish that off for their final, that portion of their final project. So.
Yeah, I think that illustrates perfectly what we were trying to get at with the EOU information literacy rubric. And to be clear, it is an information literacy rubric. This value rubric is written communication, right? So they're assessing different things. But I think we were thinking about whether it is a poster or a lesson plan or a teaching demonstration, like regardless of the product, you should be able to look and see, you know, are the students formulating questions that are appropriate for the scope of the assignment? Are they engaging in an iterative search process? Are they matching information sources to the need appropriately? And you both kind of mentioned something about the fact that a lot of students don't. We call that satisficing, like they'll go and find the YouTube video because it's easier and it's right there instead of going to the expensive teaching channel resource. Or they will choose the one at the top of the list and be like, oh, it's on my topic because it has the keywords in the title, but it's not necessarily the most relevant to the topic. And that's just normal user behavior. We all do that in our own lives when we do a Google search. I do.
Start with the convenient ones.
Yes, it depends on the need. If it's something like, I don't, health research or something, no, I'm gonna dig a little deeper, you know, or if it's gonna inform my decision about voting or something like that, I'm gonna dig a little bit deeper. But if I'm just, the example I've been using with my students is if I'm just trying to figure out the best way to prune my fruit trees, I don't need to go that deep. It's gonna be like, give me a quick summary, and that will be enough. The other thing that I think is interesting is that I think education is probably a lot like credit-bearing library courses, in that our students are reading scholarship from a lot of different disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, you know, if you're a chemistry major, you learn pretty early on what the scholarship in chemistry looks like, and it's always going to look exactly like that. It's always going to follow pretty much the same structure. But I'm coming across articles that are coming from chemistry, from psychology, from literary studies, from all different fields, and it looks a little bit different, and the tone is a little bit different, and the structure is a little bit different. So I think for you to be doing something like, you know, 5 tips on how to read a scholarly article, that is information literacy instruction.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I think that's the more important information literacy instruction than you know, here is how to type in a search string into a library database in order to find a book.
Mm-hmm.
I can demonstrate that for students, and then they can figure it out on their own. Now, yes, I could be teaching them skills to make them more expert in it, of course, but I really want them to be deeper, more critical thinkers about the information that they're encountering, and they can't do that if they don't know how to read the sources, right? And if they haven't been exposed to that a lot, I think that it is our job to start exposing them and talk them through how you actually read that content.
Well, I know this seems silly, but when I finally said this is how you actually read an article and walk them through it, the amount of students that were no longer afraid to attack it and spent the time. Because you always have students who come not prepared to class, right? Like, yeah, I read it. Well, no, you didn't.
Or they tried to read it from start to finish, and it didn't make sense.
And it didn't make sense. And
Yeah.
so just taking the time to pull it apart.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, well, of course you know how to do them. But it's just like teaching them how to find your feedback in Canvas.
Right.
We all put it in a different spot, so they actually don't know where to find your feedback versus my feedback. It's in a different spot.
Yeah.
Right? And so once it's like you point that out of this is how you read these articles, there's a lot more success happening in class because they understand this is the expected, this is how you do it, and they're like, oh, I can do this, I can be successful
Yeah.
with this.
I think that those reading strategies are really helpful. I stumbled into an effective strategy in my Writing 115 class this fall, which was to have them do primary research first and write it up in a introduction, methods, results, analysis, discussion format. So they had to do like a little, I don't know, it was like a 2-page write-up of an interview or something like that. And then I had them read the scholarly article that was also structured in that way, and they knew exactly why each section was the way it was, because they had done it from the inside. So I think I really liked that strategy, and for that class it would work really well. Like for the literature class, maybe not so much, but definitely for a writing class. Well, in addition to the rubrics, the EOU library staff put together a set of example strategies to go along with these rubric categories. And that's our last handout.
Yeah, and this was, well, without going too much into the history of it, it was an attempt to map the information literacy value rubric from AAC and U to the EOU library instruction program's information literacy learning outcomes. So we had defined learning outcomes based on the framework from our professional organization, and that's what we use to structure our teaching. But there was this interest in adopting the value rubrics and kind of looking at how we might assess those outcomes. And so this is more of a crosswalk than anything else. We kind of broke it into categories, and the categories like determine the extent of information needed, access the needed information, evaluate information and its sources critically, etc. Those are the information literacy value rubric categories. And then we mapped the learning outcomes of our instruction program to each category. And then we brainstormed ideas of class activities or assignments or assessments that you might use to assess whether or not a student has met those outcomes. And this has never really been put into practice. We've talked about it a few times with different groups. It's from December 2020. That was the last time it was updated. So, you know, it's a little out of date. It probably needs some revision, but it kind of could be a good starting point for conversations about how do we assess information literacy, because it's hard. It's one thing to be able to look at sources and say, yes, students use good sources, but how do you know if they engaged in an iterative search process if you did not get to watch them search, right?
So maybe our last question for discussion today would be, in just eyeballing this document, do you see some things that might be useful to adding or changing things that you've already been doing? And I think, I guess for me, one idea is the concept map. I feel like I truncate the search process for my students because I have so little time to dedicate. But it might be nice, it might be more effective if I slowed down the introductory piece. Like, I'm thinking particularly about inquiry, in particular about inquiry. Like, I don't spend a lot of, I sort of jump the gun and assume that students can follow my line of thinking and pick up a search that's relevant to my class, instead of asking them to take some exploratory steps. So a concept map might be something I could use to slow down the process a little bit and ask them just to collect what they know, to collect questions that they don't know that they might be interested in finding out more about, to connect questions to my material, to see where they might be springing from the readings and conversations we've been having in class to things that they're curious about. So that's just one idea of something here that strikes my attention as being something I could add or change in my approach.
I use, for that, I use Bubble Us for students to, it sort of forces an outline, or it's just a generative thing. And I teach writing, and so I'm a really text-based person. I could read a paragraph, and that's how I prefer to learn. And so it's something that isn't, I feel like I'm always looking for those other ways of seeing, other ways of formatting writing, other ways of entering, and that's the kind of concept map. And it's visual, and it's, and I like that as an early tool, and just creating it, getting their ideas out in that structure is helps them think through, helps with that inquiry stage. And it takes a little bit of time. You've got to get into the system, you've got to kind of play with it a little bit, and then you can start building it. Opposed to if I ask them to do it in class with a pen and paper, I'm probably just going to get a list. It's probably going to go a lot faster. And so that process kind of expands the time they have to do the thing, I think, in a helpful way. Not that I would want to do it that way myself. I would just want to start writing because I'm the text-based person. But I see the value in that as well.
Yeah, I'm similar. But what I find doing like outlines or concept maps helps with is kind of slowing students down instead of just jumping into their search and then picking some articles and then forcing those articles to work, like changing their topic to adjust to the articles instead of actually spending time thinking about, well, what information do I need to understand before I can really even ask this question? Background information. Students are always resistant to spend time reading background information that they're not even necessarily going to cite. If it does not lead to points, there's a lot less interest in engaging with those sources, right? So I think that can kind of help students think about, well, what do I need to know? what aspects of this topic do I need to explore? And then we can talk about what types of sources might answer those questions.
I think also, like with our different theorists that we use at the beginning of the program, looking at the alternate different views from each theorist, just looking at how they're presented. I think there's a couple different ideas on here that could be added in. And I haven't taught that class in a while, so they may be doing this, but just looking at the information in a different way to really understand the different viewpoints when they're looking at, and I think they're using articles now to kind of look at those different theorists, but just, looking at the sources that are presented and then looking at those different views would be really helpful for students, especially in the beginning of the program when they're really trying to grasp kind of those foundational pieces that
And
then they're going to pull through.
Synthesize to be able to identify them as distinct theories and then figure out where the overlaps are.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great.
I like this second one down, journaling the search strategies and the search tools used. I think that could be especially helpful for my online asynchronous classes where it can feel a little harder to keep track of their process. But even with on-campus students, I think that could be really helpful. And almost, again, it almost seems like I could imagine students sort of hurriedly finding something that's not a great fit, then coming across this assignment and realizing, oh, I need to like slow down and explain what database I was using and the keywords and like do the narrative, do the explanation of what happened. That might then prompt them to go through the proper steps that they, have been taught or that they know. Being asked prompts like, is this peer reviewed? How do you know? Is this credible? Where did you find it? And the annotated bib usually has that. Sometimes I'll break it down. Who's the author? What is the title of the article? And that can be really difficult for them to figure out the difference between the title of the article and the title of the journal. And it's a lot of literacy that they have to start learning. But doing that kind of in a shared discussion board prompt where they can see each other's processes. I always love a discussion board prompt for that reason, where they can learn from each other too.
I'm almost envisioning sort of like a table where students would, put in the sort of search, the database, the search terms, the result, database, search terms, result, initially early in the term, and then maybe coming back to that later in the term when I'm asking them to do another search to see how they are still using those strategies, if they have different strategies. Were they successful earlier? Have they developed since then? It might be kind of fun to do a little reflection on that.
That's so scaffolded. And that layer is beautiful and so helpful and hard to pull off.
Hard to
right?
pull off,
Because
yeah. But it gets at the iterative quality of research
Yes.
that you would revisit and revisit.
Yeah.
Well, we are running out of time, so thank you very much for being part of this conversation. And I think if folks need the materials, maybe can we link to these materials from where the video is located?
Yeah, I can link them on the CTLA website.
Okay,
Yeah,
that'd be great.
absolutely.
So if people want to come and get copies of them, they can
absolutely.
do that. Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Yay. Thank you.